Hi guys, this is CA Balakrishna. In this class, we will be revising Essay 330, that is responses of the auditor to assessed risks. Now, if you observe, in Essay 315, auditor has identified the risks of material misstatements. Now, under Essay 330, auditor will give responses to this assessed risk of material misstatements. Now, how the auditor will respond? Basically, auditor will respond by performing further audit procedures. If you observe, in Essay 315, auditor has not obtained any evidences. He just determined the risk of material misstatement. Now, under Essay 330, auditor will obtain evidences whether the misstatements actually exist or not. How he will obtain evidences? He will obtain evidences by performing further audit procedures. Okay, this process of obtaining evidences by performing further audit procedures is known as responses of the auditor to assessed risks. Now, what will be included in this further audit procedures? Basically, under this further audit procedures, there will be two types of procedures. One is test of controls and another one is substantive procedures. Now, first of all, we'll understand what is meant by test of controls and what is meant by substantive procedures. Basically, the name itself suggests that test of controls are the procedures that are performed to determine whether the controls are operating effectively or not. Those type of procedures will be known as test of controls. Now, you might get a doubt that the objective of the auditor is to determine whether the amounts that are represented in the financial statements are true and fair or not. Okay, basically the auditor wants to give an opinion whether financial statements are giving true and fair view or not. Now, in order to determine whether the amounts that are represented in financial statements are correct or not, why the auditor is checking the controls? It would be sufficient if he directly verify these financial statements now. Instead, why he is checking the controls by performing test of controls? Let us understand this. See, basically, let's say this is the accounting data, or you can say these are the accounting transactions in the entity. Now, around this accounting transactions, the management will implement controls. Okay, now the objective of the auditor is to determine whether these transactions are correct or not. In order to determine whether these transactions are correct or not, what the auditor will do is, first of all, the auditor will perform test of controls to determine whether the controls that are placed by the organization around these transactions are working effectively or not. Okay, by testing the controls, auditor will identify those controls which are not working properly. Okay, and apart from identifying the controls which are not working properly, auditor will also identify those areas where controls are not implemented. Okay, we'll be calling it as gap. Okay, auditor will identify gaps. Okay, the areas where controls are not at all implemented. Now, what is the use of identifying these types of gaps or ineffective controls? The use to the auditor is that auditor can directly perform his substantive procedures on the transactions of this area. Okay, auditor has identified that in this particular area, controls are not working properly. That means there is a chance that the transactions in that particular area might not be correct. Thereby, auditor will direct his substantive procedures directly in this area. And the same would be here. If the auditor finds that there is gap in internal controls, then auditor will direct his substantive procedures directly to this area. Basically, testing controls will save the time of the auditor. Hope this is clear. That is the reason why before performing substantive procedures, auditor will first of all perform test of controls. Okay. What is the purpose of test of controls? Purpose of test of controls is to evaluate operating effectiveness of controls. See, auditor will not give opinion whether the controls are operating effectively or not. He will just check whether controls are operating effectively or not in order to determine the amount of substantive procedures that he has to perform. Okay, that is the reason why he is checking test of controls, but he is not checking test of controls in order to give an opinion of on the test of controls. Okay, the objective of the auditor is to give opinion on the financial statements, but not to give opinion on the test of controls. Hope this is clear. This point we have already discussed in the previous standards. That is test of controls. Now coming to substantive procedures, we'll understand the difference between test of controls and substantive procedures with the help of an example. Basically, these substantive procedures can be divided into two parts. First of all, test of details and substantive analytical procedures. Let us see first of all. Now let's say, for example, there is a bank reconciliation statement, BRS. Basically, an accountant in the organization has prepared this BRS. Now once the BRS has been prepared, some higher level authority, like let's say CFO, will put his signature on this BRS. There will be some reconciliation that is performed in the BRS. Now auditor has to check this BRS. Now if auditor performs a test of controls on this BRS, auditor will check whether there is signature of the higher authority. Okay, this is checking whether the BRS contains a signature is test of controls. Now after performing test of controls, auditor wants to verify this BRS in detail. That means he wants to recalculate the calculations that are performed in this BRS. Okay, he wants to watch the balances of cash balance and bank balance. Okay, this procedure of detailedly checking the BRS by recalculating the BRS is known as substantive procedure. Okay, basically in case of internal controls, auditor will check the procedure or process, whereas in case of substantive procedure, auditor will check the entire transaction. Okay, now this substantive procedure can be of two types. One is test of details. Under test of details, let's say the management has given some type of assertions. For example, assertion relating to completeness, accuracy, valuation, like this various types of assertions have been given by the management. Now the auditor will obtain evidence relating to each type of this assertion that has been given by the management under this test of details. For example, let's say relating to the assertion of inventory, relating to existence of inventory. This is one of the assertion that has been given by the management. Okay, existence of inventory. Now in order to obtain evidence relating to this assertion of existence of inventory, auditor will perform physical checking. Okay, this will come under test of details. Hope this is clear. Next is substantive analytical procedure. I have already discussed that this analytical procedures can be used as both risk assessment procedure as well as substantive analytical procedure. Okay, while discussing SA 315, I have discussed this point. Now there I have also given you example of how the analytical procedures can be used as risk assessment procedure and substantive procedures. Okay, this is basically, these are the procedures that the auditor will perform. Next, note: substantive procedures alone cannot provide sufficient appropriate audit evidence. See, in his further audit procedures, auditor will perform some amount of test of controls and some amount of substantive procedures. Okay, he will not perform only test of controls, or he will not perform only substantive procedures. He will perform combination of test of controls and substantive procedures. Okay, now how much amount of test of controls has to be performed and how much amount of substantive procedures has to be performed, how the auditor will decide this. Okay, how much of the test of controls has to be performed and how much of the substantive procedures has to be performed. Let us see. Basically, auditor will decide this based on the control risk. See, let's say this is the control risk. This side the risk is low, this side the risk is high. What is control risk? Control risk is a risk that controls might not identify the misstatements. Okay, that would be known as control risk. Now, let me use another pen. See, now the control risk is low. The control risk is low. That means controls are operating effectively. Okay, controls are working properly. In that case, auditor will perform more of test of controls. Okay, auditor will perform more test of controls and less substantive procedures. Okay, since controls are operating effectively, if auditor gets evidence that these controls are operating effectively, then auditor can reduce his substantive procedures. Thereby, if the control risk is low, auditor will perform more of test of controls and will obtain evidence that controls are working properly. Okay, after obtaining this evidence, auditor will just perform some of the substantive procedures. Now, in case control risk is very high, that means controls are not working properly. In case controls are not working properly, auditor cannot perform more of test of controls. Instead, auditor will check the transactions in detail. Okay, since controls are not working properly, auditor has to check all the transactions in detail. Thereby, he will perform more of substantive procedures. Less of test of controls. Hope this is clear. This is how auditor will determine how much of test of controls has to be performed and how much of substantive procedures has to be performed. Next, coming to test of controls. Now, while performing test of controls, auditor has to determine nature, timing and extent of this test of controls. How the auditor will determine this? First of all, let us see nature. How the auditor will determine nature of test of controls that has to be performed. Basically, for this, auditor will consider three factors. Based on these three factors, auditor will determine the nature of test of controls to be performed. First one, how the controls were applied. Okay, whether they are manual controls or automated controls. Okay, how the organization is actually applying the controls. Based on the type of controls, auditor will determine the nature of test of controls that has to be performed. Next, by whom they were applied. Okay, actually who is the person in the organization that is performing the controls, or whether it is automated, whether any particular type of software is implemented as a control. Based on this also, auditor will determine the nature of test of controls to be performed and the consistency of the controls. Okay, auditor will consider these three factors in order to determine the nature of test of controls that has to be performed by the auditor. Next, we will see timing later on. We will first of all see extent of controls that has to be performed by the auditor. Now let's say there is control number 1. Auditor wants to check this control number 1. While checking the control number 1, auditor will first of all determine whether this control is operating independently or it is dependent on some other control. Okay, now let's say auditor found that this control number 1 is dependent on control number 2. In that case, auditor has to check both control number 2 and control number 1. In case control number 1 is operating independently, in that case auditor will check only control number 1. Okay, now the extent of test of controls will be determined based on whether controls to be tested depends on other controls. Hope this is clear. Next, timing of test of controls. Timing, particular time or throughout the period. Let us see. First of all, test of controls performed during interim period. Now see, this is the financial year. Now after 6 months, after completion of 6 months, here auditor has performed test of controls. Okay, auditor has performed test of controls, and based on test of controls he would have determined whether the controls are operating effectively or not operating effectively. Whatever the decision, the auditor might have come to a decision at this point after 6 months by performing test of controls. Now at the end of the year, again the auditor comes for performing the audit. Now here, whether auditor has to check the controls during this intervening period or not will be dependent based on some factors. Okay, now first of all the auditor will see whether the controls that I have already tested here are operating same, okay, or whether there are any changes that have been made by the management. Okay, first of all the auditor will determine this. Okay, what the auditor will determine? Auditor will determine whether there are any changes that have been made to the controls. In case there are any changes that have been made, then the auditor has to perform test of controls even in this period also. Okay, okay, that is how auditor will determine whether to check the controls in this intervening period or not. See, auditor will first of all obtain evidence of changes in controls in remaining period. In case there is any changes, the auditor will perform test of controls and determine additional evidence to be obtained from remaining period. In case there are any additional controls that have been implemented during the next 6 months. Okay, apart from the controls that were present in the first 6 months, management has also implemented some other controls in the remaining 6 months. In this case, auditor will check or auditor will perform test of controls on these newly implemented controls also. Hope this is clear. Next, plans to rely on test of controls performed in preceding year. Let's say here this is one financial year. Now let us take it, sir. See, this is one financial year. Now in the previous financial year also the same auditor has audited this entity. Okay, in the previous financial year also auditor would have performed a test of controls. Now in this current year, auditor wants to rely on the test of controls that were performed in previous year, whether he can rely or not. For this he has to first of all check whether there are any changes. Okay, no, yes, there are changes. There are changes in the controls in the current period. If there are changes, obviously the auditor has to perform test of controls in the current period also. On the other side, no, there are no changes to the controls during this current period. They are operating in the same way as they were operating in the previous year. In this case, auditor has to make sure that he will test the controls at least once in every third audit. Hope this is clear. In case there are changes to the test of controls, he has changes to the controls, then he has to perform test of controls in the current year. In case there are no changes to the controls in the current period, then auditor has to make sure that he will test each control at least one time in every third audit. Hope this is clear. Let us see. Plans to rely on test of controls performed in preceding year. First of all, he will check there are changes to the controls. In this case, he will perform test of controls in the current year. On the other hand, he finds that there are no changes in the controls. In that case, auditor has to make sure that he will test at least once in every third audit. Hope this is clear. Next, if auditor determines a risk to be significant, then test relevant controls in the current year. See, even though the controls are operating in the same way as they were operating in the previous year, but the auditor determines that there is a high risk in that particular area. Okay, in case auditor determines that there is high risk in a particular area, then he has to mandatorily check the controls relating to that area, because that area is prone to high risk. Hope this is clear. Next, factors to be considered in determining whether to rely on test of controls performed during previous year. See, here auditor is planning to rely on the controls that are performed in the previous year. Now, while determining whether to rely on the controls that are performed in the previous year or not, auditor will consider certain factors. Okay, based on these factors, auditor will come to a conclusion whether to rely on the controls that are performed in the previous year or to perform test of controls again in this current year also. What are those factors? First one, effectiveness of other elements of internal controls. What are the other elements of internal controls? Control environment and monitoring, whether it has been whether the controls are properly being monitored or not, and information systems. These are the elements of internal controls. Based on effectiveness of other elements of internal controls, auditor will determine whether to rely on previous year's test of controls or to freshly perform the test of controls. Next, characteristics of controls, whether the controls are manual or automated. Even this will affect the decision of the auditor whether to rely on test of controls that are performed previously. Next, effectiveness of general IT controls, how the general IT controls are operating, and risk of material misstatement and extent of reliance on control. Okay, in the current year, auditor would have determined the risk of material misstatement. Okay, based on this risk of material misstatement that has been determined by the auditor will decide whether to rely on the test of controls that were performed previously. Next, effectiveness of controls and its application by the entity. Based on all these factors, auditor will take a decision whether to rely or not. Next, substantive procedures. Irrespective of assessed risk of material misstatement, auditor shall design and perform substantive procedures for each material class of transaction, account balance and disclosures. See, auditor cannot avoid performing substantive procedures. Okay, it is only whether auditor will perform high substantive procedures or low substantive procedures, but whatever the situation it might be, auditor has to perform substantive procedures. He cannot avoid performing substantive procedures. Okay, based on the operating effectiveness of the controls, auditor will determine how much amount of substantive procedures to be performed, but he cannot eliminate performing substantive procedures. Hope this is clear. Next, nature, timing, extent of substantive procedures. Nature of substantive procedures. Basically, auditor will determine the nature of substantive procedures based on the type of assertion that he is addressing. Okay, depends on type of assertion you want to address. Next, timing. It is same as that we have discussed in case of test of controls. If performed at interim period, auditor has performed substantive procedures in the interim period. Okay, for first 6 months, auditor has performed substantive procedures for first 6 months. Now, in the remaining 6 months, auditor has to decide whether it is sufficient only to perform substantive procedures or to perform both test of controls and substantive procedures. Okay, perform test of controls and substantive procedures for remaining period or only substantive procedure for remaining period. Okay, based on the effectiveness of the controls that are operating, auditor will decide whether to perform only substantive procedures or to perform both test of controls and substantive procedures for the remaining period. Next, extent of substantive procedures to be performed. Okay, the extent of substantive procedures to be performed depends on control assessment that has been performed by the auditor. Okay, for that you can refer this diagram. Okay, this diagram which we have discussed here. Okay, by this we have completed revision of essay 330. In the next video we will be starting with a revision of 400 series. Okay.